Howdy everyone. Alright, so now I'm on the other side of the airplane. I'm actually on the right hand side of the airplane. Of course, this is the top. This is the firewall, of course. Here's my shim. And this is what I was talking about with that 6.5 inches. This is a little bit of a better view, I hope. So this is the center line here of the airplane. And from there, the instructions tell you to come over roughly 6.5 inches. That's where this length of hinge is going to stop. So I went 6.5 plus a little bit. By a little bit, I mean like 1/8 of an inch. And I marked a line here. And then you can see that my shim comes up to that line. What that does is you can see where the hole is going to be for the shim, right? So here's where the hole is going to be. You can see where the line has been marked. And the difference between the two is my edge distance. So I've got really good edge distance here. However, when you have the actual hinge in place, you don't want to cut where there's a knuckle, right? You don't want to cut through a knuckle. You want to have an entire knuckle width, and that's where you cut off your hinge. So if the knuckle ends up being whichever knuckle comes closest to this mark, that's where you would cut it. And then, of course, you would do the same on the other end down there. You'd have to position the hinge so that when you go through an existing hole, you can have good edge distance, but you don't have to cut through the end of a knuckle. So like I had said, by doing that, this is the length that I came up with here. So you can see I've got a full knuckle on this end, and I've got a full knuckle on this end here. And when I fit this to the fuselage, between the end of that knuckle and this first rivet, there's plenty of edge distance. And then when I go around to that other side, like I had just showed you, when I get to this side, I have between this hole and the end, I have really good edge distance. And I'm not cutting any knuckle in half. I've got full hinge knuckles on both ends. And that will put the hinge at that rough 6.5 inch mark from center to the end. I hope that makes sense. I'll show it again once I get it actually in place. And the 6.5 inch is just a guesstimate, right? What's important is that you're not cutting knuckles on your hinge. So I'm just starting with the shim, and what I have elected to do was I cut it to length, maybe a little bit long, and from the end of the shim I went minimal edge distance plus like 1/8, and I drilled a hole and I countersunk it. I mean, I dimpled it, because all of these are dimpled underneath here. Now that I have the end established, I have a center line drawn. I pre-marked the shim with a center line. I hope that shows up down through the center. Now that I have this initial hole clecoed, it's just a matter of looking down through all of these holes, lining up that center line with the center of the hole as you look through it, holding it in place. Make sure that you push it into the corner. And then, like I always do, using an appropriate size drill, I'll just stick the drill through the hole, spin it a few times, and that will leave the marks that you see here. So I'll uncleco this, and I'll drill these holes, and then I'll put it back in place, and I'll cleco all of those, and then I'll line up the next few, mark them, take this off, drill those, put it back in place, cleco all of those, align it, drill the next, or mark the next few, take it apart. That's just how I like to work. You could, in theory, mount it here, pull it across, mount it on the other side, and then just match drill everything else. But I just don't like to work that way. I like to work, especially when you're working with curves. If you do that, if you pin the ends and then you start working toward the center, if you start working toward one end, you may start to get some waves and stuff in the shim. I just like to work it like I've just explained it. That's basically how I work all of my my match drilling holes and things like that. So like I said before, I'll continue to do this. I'll drill it and dimple it, attach it, mark it, drill it, dimple it. When I get that done, then I'll probably use this as a template to do the hinge. But I'll show you guys all that stuff when I get to it. Talk to you later. Howdy everyone. This first hinge segment is now complete, and of course it's just temporarily installed with Clecos. But you can see that it runs from, this is the first knuckle here, and it runs from here all the way over to about right there. So it's more than halfway across. So like I had mentioned before, when you look at the plans, they give you a reference from center line. You come over roughly 6.5 inches, and that is the end line, if you will, for this hinge. And then you skip 3 1/8 of an inch, and from that distance you do the rest. So there's going to be a gap in here with no hinge, and that's just so you can pull the hinge pins out when you want to remove the cowl. So this is the longest piece, of course, of the two, and I decided to do this one first just because it's the longest, and that's just what I chose to do. So what I wanted to point out is that this is, you can see that this is a full knuckle here. I didn't cut this knuckle at all. So I've got a full knuckle here, and I'll go around to the other side here. And you can see I've got a full knuckle here. This is the line that I had drawn. I don't know if that will show up. This black line here is the line that I had drawn for that rough 6.5 inch mark from center line over. It's actually a little bit longer. 6.5 would have been like where the Cleco is located. But you can see if I wanted to maintain that exactly, I would have had to cut this knuckle. And I don't like to do that. So again, you measure off from center line, and then you kind of position where you want the hinge with a full knuckle on each end. If it's a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, it's not that big of a deal. But this worked out really well. You can see where the Cleco is, and you can compare that to the end of the hinge, and you can see that I've got really good edge distance from this hole to this edge. So now I'm going to make this other hinge. Here is my reference line. This is, again, this is that 3 1/8 roughly gap that needs to be maintained here. I'll locate the hinge at this end with a full knuckle, and then I'll just bring it around, and wherever it ends up being closest to this line, that's where I'll cut it. And then the gap will be whatever that gap is, but I don't want it any smaller than the 3 1/8. So like I had done with this hinge, I will now lay this out for the length for the shim. I do the shim first. Once I get the shim drilled and dimpled, I'll put it in place, and then I start working on the actual hinge. I'll draw a reference line, the length of the hinge. That reference line just represents where I want the holes to be on the hinge itself. So I'll draw that line, the length of the hinge. I'll remove some Clecos. I'll put the hinge up underneath here. I'll look through the hole, line up my reference line, and then make my marks. That's how I had done the other one. And I do those like 4 or 5 holes at a time. And then I'll drill it, countersink it, install it with the shim, Cleco the new holes that I had just drilled, cleco that in place, and then mark like the next 4 or 5. Take it off, drill those, come back, put it back on, cleco all of those, and then do the next set. This one will obviously be a lot quicker because it's a lot shorter. So, oh, one more thing. Let me go back around here. So, of course, in theory, you have the edge of the skin here, this skin edge. The cowling is going to go up and it's going to butt up against that edge. If you look at the hinge, here's half of a hinge here. If you go from this edge here in, your minimum edge distance, which is about 3/16 of an inch, for the, what are there? They're 426-3s rivets used in this. So the minimum edge distance is roughly 3/16 of an inch. If you come back 3/16 of an inch and draw your reference line, that will stick the hinge a little bit forward of this front edge of the skin. So when you have your cowling in place, if you look through the crack, you'll see the hinge. You won't be looking in between these knuckles. It will just give you a little bit of a cleaner look when the cowling is on, so that the gaps between the knuckles won't be shown. Hope that makes sense. So that's how I have it positioned. I'm going to start working on the other side, and I will talk to you guys later.